And I shall hand over to you, Manon. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm, of course, very excited to be here, and I'm also very grateful to have been invited here to present parts of my research. And of course, I'm also grateful for everyone attending this event. Today, I'm presenting some of the results of my doctoral thesis, in which I analyzed the function, the use, and the symbolic meaning of bats in the funerary context of ancient Egypt, and in particular, their relationship with the so-called mother goddesses. So goddesses that are involved in the cyclical rebirth of the sun. The reason why I chose to focus on the funerary context is not because I'm not interested in daily life, actually quite the opposite. However, besides the results of my PhD, I would also like to take this opportunity to take the investigation a bit further today and also talk about something else, something that I've been working on more recently, namely the meaning of the throne and its relationship to bats. At first, this might seem or sound a bit mysterious, considering that the throne and bats are two entirely different things in our modern worldview. But I hope that it will become clear at the end why I put the two into the same category. Now, before I talk about bats as such, I would like to briefly discuss my choice of terminology. I know this might sound rather boring, but I think that it is important. Usually, when we encounter this type of object in an everyday life context, or what we think of as an everyday life context, we call it bat. But when it occurs in the funerary sphere, we prefer the term bier. Tutankhamun's 3 animal-shaped ritual beds, his long-legged ritual beds, about which I will talk in more detail later, are referred to as couches, even though they are likewise located in the funerary ritual sphere and look very similar, if not to say nearly identical, to the aforementioned bier. So these are the terms that are generally used in Egyptological literature. But where do these terms actually come from? So the term bed refers to the piece of furniture that we still use today to spend the night on sleeping. But biers occur in an entirely different context. Thus, they have been used, for instance, in the Christian setting to lay out the body with or without the coffin in the church and to transport the deceased to the tomb. Here, the bier has obviously a very different purpose than the bed in our understanding. Now, when it comes to the word couch, we mostly think of a sofa where you can lie down in a relaxed way in front of the TV, maybe eating chips. As such, the word and the ideas connected to it is linked to the Greco-Roman kline, itself based on Mesopotamian precursors, which could be used as a dining couch at banquets, as well as a bed to sleep upon. And I strongly suspect that this is the origin of the terms used in Egyptology. So basically a term adopted from the so-called classical studies, likely classical archaeology. So overall, and this is important to bear in mind, each and every one of these terms already comes with a very specific cluster of connotations and predefined roles. Moreover, the use of these different designations already characterizes the 3 object groups as completely separate from each other in the context and form as well, and as by extension also in function. So these words create boundaries since the very beginning, even before their actual usage has been investigated in any detail. However, and this is not just true for furniture, it should be stressed that similarity in form does not automatically entail similarity in function, just like dissimilarity in form does not necessarily mean dissimilarity in function. And I will show you examples for this later. And I think that's one of the issues with the bats, because they look so similar to what we understand as a bat. It makes it very difficult because very often we just don't ask the questions. So in general, what I would like to point out here is that the words we use reflect our own understanding of the world and create artificial boundaries between objects that actually might belong together. So these categorizations tell us more about ourselves and our own cultural understanding than about ancient Egypt. And for this reason, I prefer to just use the more general, the more neutral term bed for all of these pieces of furniture, even though I'm aware that the term bed again comes with its very own issues and biases as well. At least by using only the term bed in all these instances, I was able to keep a more open mind when it comes to this object type, and to not just accept the underlying assumptions propagated through the different terms found in the literature. But what exactly is a bed? After looking into the beds of different cultures and from different times, I tried to describe the piece of furniture as vaguely as possible. So I looked at everything that's kind of a non-closed platform, carried or not by four legs, yet mostly elevated in some way from the ground, upon which one could lie down, at least in a crouched position, but could also sit on as a bed. So I know, very vague, and probably not what you generally would understand as a bed, but I had to start somewhere. Moreover, also in our understanding of the bed, or also beds in other periods and other cultures, several accessories are usually part of this construct bed. So in ancient Egypt, that would be the headrest, a blanket. And actually, when we think about our own beds, the most important part actually is the mattress, the cushions, the duvets, because without that, it's not really a bed. So it needs specific types to really form this whole. And this vague definition fits, of course, a bed like this one, so the bed of Queen Mehetweret from Dynasty 4. And without a doubt, this is what we recognize as a bed. But also on a side note, this board that you see, which some people interpret as a headboard, just as most of our beds have headboards, it is not. Ancient Egyptians do not have headboards, they have footboards. The headboards comes from Mesopotamia via Greece into our houses. So I can only stress this, it's a footboard. Yet at the same time, this vague definition also includes scenes like this one, depicting men lying atop a mat, their head resting atop a headrest and being covered by a blanket. And I think you can see here this line, this is actually representing the blanket. And in this case, what you see here is actually a campfire. So this scene was interpreted as men resting outside, so underneath the night sky, close to a fireplace, because when you sleep, one of the recurring motives you find, you want to feel warm, and especially in the desert in Egypt, it can be rather cold. So and this, I think it should also be noticed, so this is probably how most of the ancient Egyptians slept, so not under the night sky per se, close to fire, but on mats. And this is, the reason for this is that beds are actually status symbols. Not only were they made of expensive wood, so constructed by experienced craftsmen, so not everyone would have been able to actually construct a bed, but the fact that they literally, also figuratively, elevate their owners above the ground and above others, which have played an important role. In fact, wooden beds like the one of Mehetweret are actually some sort of framed mat placed atop legs, so again, lifting her above anyone else. And of course, this definition also applies to the beds found in the funerary context, as for instance, the scene here showing Anubis, a priest wearing an Anubis mask, tending to Nachtamun in his tomb in Deir Medina. The deceased, probably inside his anthropomorphic coffin, lies atop his leonine bed, his head resting on a pillow, a red pillow, and you can see that here. While a blanket or some sort of cover hangs here above the footboard. So even though these objects might look differently from each other and occur in varying contexts, ranging from very simple to more elaborate models, I think that they actually all belong together. So these are not separate objects. Now, after these more theoretical aspects, I would like to give you an overview of the use and meaning of beds in the funerary context of ancient Egypt. Already in pre-dynastic times, beds can be part of burials. In Tarkhan, for instance, the excavator Flinders Petrie discovered over 50 beds in the pre- and early dynastic tombs there, whereas only 2 of them were mere burial equipment found lying upside down atop the coffin. The others obviously played a more active role in these interments, as they carried the deceased in a crouched position within these tombs, and mostly or generally without an intermediate coffin. And this is generally true for these early times, but later on this changes. So when looking at this arrangement, I also think that the contracted position, burial position that was so popular in these early times actually imitates a sleeper rather than a fetus, especially if we consider that a sleeping position is visible and can be observed by everyone. Noteworthy on these early beds are also the papyriform terminals, so these here, that in some cases actually look also like handles. And as similar handles are also found on contemporaneous carrying chairs like this one from the Narmer mace head, one might even wonder whether the beds were also used for the transport of the body, so transporting the body to the tomb and depositing it with the bed. This might also explain why beds and sedans are closely connected to their symbolic meaning in later times. And I will come back to the symbolic meaning of beds in just a bit. Although there are beds with simple post legs, most of these early beds already have animal-shaped legs, in these times bovine legs, like this example in Brussels. These are often referred to as bull's legs, which at least for later times is inaccurate, as beds are mainly female since the Old Kingdom. For the pre- and early dynastic periods, there are no real hints as to the gender of beds, and I don't think that we could actually see the gender of these bovids from their legs alone. And it's dangerous also to just assume that the later beliefs should apply to these earlier periods as well. We just don't know. So with the use of a more neutral term like bovine, I think you just cannot go wrong. So I would just not use bull. So since the Old Kingdom then, bats are definitely female. And one of the oldest bats is Neith. Neith is known as a sky goddess that is elevated by her father Shu and thus separated from her husband Geb, which you can see lying here on the ground, actually being the earth god, who is generally depicted, always depicted lying beneath her. Neith only touches Geb with the tips of her fingers and her toes, so with 4 points in total. And this is significant, as the overall position corresponds, of course, to the 4 posts of the sky, the 4 cardinal points. In ancient Egypt, the sky was imagined as a kind of platform resting on 4 pillars, as you can see here. Even though the hieroglyphic sign for sky is only ever shown from one side, so marked here in blue, so that would be the hieroglyph. But actually the hieroglyph is kind of an abbreviation for the whole structure. So it might not be surprising that beds were associated with the sky goddess and the sky as such, because after all, when we look at it, beds likewise consist of a platform carried by 4 legs. And actually, I mean, they fit right in. All of them from a very basic point of understanding are platforms carried by 4 posts or 4 legs. So the connection between the sky, Neith, and the bed might originally have been based on this outer resemblance. However, soon enough, the bed was also in its meaning closely linked to the sky, and in particular its goddess. Thus, for instance, in the pyramid texts, Neith is associated with a sky bed upon which the deceased king rests. From another passage, we know that this sky bed is known as Men-Mut, which in my opinion should be translated as something like may the mother endure, the term Mut in Egyptian meaning mother. So the name of this piece of furniture alone already stresses the importance of the mother, and as such, the mother goddess in this context. In fact, the bed is the representative of the mother who protects the sleeper deceased and guarantees their eternal rebirth. This interpretation is, of course, not only based on the interpretation of this term alone, but it is also found in many other contexts. As sky goddess, Neith is the mother of the sun, which she swallows every night in order to give birth to it again in the morning. Moreover, she swallows also the stars and the moon again every night, so it's the opposite, of course, in order to give birth to them again at night. So, and this idea of this cyclical swallowing and being reborn plays such a crucial role in the whole of ancient Egyptian history. After all, this is the rhythm that every deceased wants to follow as well. So the deceased want to be also, want to die at night, but they want to be reborn, rejuvenated every morning as well. So Neith becomes the mother goddess par excellence, so the universal mother of everyone. And as such, she's also the coffin, for instance, that embraces the deceased, like most notably shown in the much later papyrus Rind 1. Even though this papyrus is separated from the pyramid text by millennia, this type of image and related texts are continuously found throughout all the periods of ancient Egypt, attesting again to the immense importance of the mother goddess at all times. In fact, the vignette of Papyrus Rind is the logical conclusion, in a way the culmination of this essential belief attested since the pyramid text at the latest. As for the coffins and sarcophagi, they have two functions, namely on the one hand carrying and protecting the deceased forever, just like in a womb, and on the other hand guaranteeing their rebirth. It is certainly no coincidence that these are also the two main functions of the bed. In fact, bed and coffin or sarcophagus constituting a unity, some sort of microcosm into which the sleeper deceased is placed in order to reborn. So it's not surprising that the goddesses that occur in the context of coffins and sarcophagi are also the goddesses that occur in association with beds. This close relationship is also found in archaeological material, because beds are mainly placed either inside of coffins, sarcophagi, or they carry the coffin, the sarcophagi. So it's always just a whole construct that belongs so closely together. And we will see other examples for this in just a moment. So now I would like to move on to the New Kingdom, the period from which most of our evidence actually stems. So when we think about beds in the New Kingdom, we think, of course, about the 10 beds with which Tutankhamun was buried. Here, however, I would like to discuss his 3 ritual beds that were standing along the west wall of the antechamber. And you can see them here looking towards the burial chamber and towards the king, of course. Although these beds are by no means unique, we actually have several such fragments from other royal tombs of the New Kingdom as well. They are certainly the most complete, so they always function as the example par excellence. But we, of course, have to remember that the burial of Tutankhamun is by no means typical. So again, it's hard to see or hard to assess based on this tomb how other tombs would have looked like. But I can tell you that this type of bed was found in the consecutive reigns as well. The first bed of this group, so when we go back, the one that stands furthest away here, has a hippopotamus head, a leonine body, and a crocodile back and tail. An inscription carved into the frame between the two heads, so you can't see it, but it would be atop this board, refers to the bed as Amit. And for this reason, you often read in the literature that this bed represents the devourers from the weighing of the heart scene, so from the Book of the Dead. However, considering what I just told you about beds and their motherly, caring, protective side, this just doesn't really fit. The devourers might be many things, but in the New Kingdom, she certainly was not motherly. She acquired some motherly traits later on, that's fair to say, but she always remained a dangerous creature. Moreover, when comparing the composition of the devourers with that of the bed, it is noticeable that they are actually inverted, as the devourers has a crocodile back and a hippopotamus rear, not the other way around. A crocodile head, sorry. It should be noted that the earliest tangible evidence we have for this devourer, so the one on the left, actually stems from the time of Horemheb, so after Tutankhamun. So if this bed would have indeed been the devourers, it would have been the first attestation of this being. So all in all, I think that it is safe to say that the bed in question cannot be the devourers. A composite being which fits the criteria far better is the goddess Taweret. Which, contrary to the devourers, is an old deity which might already be attested since pre-dynastic times. She plays since her earliest occurrence an important role in the context of childbirth, and not just childbirth in the sense of the birth in the everyday life context, but of course also in the context of rebirth. Through this association with birth and the protection of mother and child, she becomes a protector of the sun god, and eventually she becomes a mother of the sun god herself. So a role in which she is intrinsically linked to Nut, So Taweret, although a lot of people always say it's a minor deity or even say it's a demon, she's actually a mother goddess as well. So she's quite important and she's quite powerful. And thus Taweret herself, in this case of the bed, she acquires the ability to swallow the sun and to give birth again to it in the morning. So in this case, the verb as in amit, does not mean to devour, so in this negative sense, but it simply means to swallow without any negative connotations, characterizing, as I said, Taweret as the swallower, so the one who swallows the sun, and by extension, of course, the sleeper deceased. So this swallowing process marks the beginning of the rebirth process of the regeneration journey, corresponding to the rite of separation, and thus the preliminal sphere. And in this, of course, her function corresponds to the function I mentioned before in the context of Nut. So Nut as well is the one that swallows the sun, but Taweret can take over this role as well. So of course, this is only the first step of this whole journey. This particular bed stands also, probably for this reason, the furthest away from the burial chamber with the king, because the movement goes from the furthest away, goes towards the king. With every bed, it comes closer until the end point is reached. Also, it should be mentioned that the bed, even though we have two beings actually represented here, merely represents a single goddess. The doubling of this carrier animal is due to the form of the bed and the practicality. So it would just have been impossible to place a single head in the center of the frame for practical as well also as aesthetical reasons. It would just have looked a bit weird, I think. But by doubling or splitting the animal, the bed is better balanced out optically, and it would have been easier for the priests to reach the sleeper deceased lying on top of it without coffins. So Tutankhamun would have been placed as a mummy on this, because with these long, thin legs, they would not have been able to carry his coffins, which are really, really heavy. And also that's the reason why this type of bed has these long legs, because the priests needed to reach the mummy easily without having to work with the bent back for hours, etc. So the bed in this case is really adapted to the purpose and really tells us about the practical use as well. So there's a lot actually we can get from this type of beds. So the interpretation of the other two beds, the lioness and the cow, is not always as straightforward as in the case of Taweret and Neith. And one of the reasons for this is that the inscriptions naming the two beds, so the two other beds, have most likely been swapped, so that the leonine bed carries the text that was originally meant for the bovine bed and vice versa. Moreover, I believe that they were placed in the wrong order as well, and I will show you why a bit later. So as the leonine bed should have followed immediately after Taweret Amit here, and should have been placed in the center of the bed triad, not the bovine one, I will discuss the leonine one first. Although I refer to this bed as leonine, it is actually not entirely leonine as such. It represents a panther lion, so a lion that incorporated elements from the panther. And panther is the designation used in Egyptology to describe this kind of mixture between leopards and cheetahs, which cannot and should not be separated in the religious context. So when you have different contexts, Egyptians were very well able to differentiate between them and really made it clear which animal they meant. But as soon as we move on to the religious context, they get mixed because, well, they have a similar appearance, and actually Egyptians thought that one belongs to the north and one is the corresponding animal from the south. So they are connected. Now, in the New Kingdom, the panther can also take on these leonine characteristics, most notably the mane. So again, more phthalids get mixed. In the case of this bat, this is also what happens. So we have a lion, actually a lioness, even though we have the mane, but we also have these lacrimal stripes. So these blue, what looks like tears, which is a characteristic found with cheetahs, not lions. So the reason for this, of course, again, is not the inability of the craftsman to represent a lion or that they would not know how a lion actually looks, but by adding several traits of other animals to the lion in this case, the Egyptians could add another symbolic layer. So I cannot really discuss the meaning of the panther in this case, as that would be a different talk. But due to the similarity of its spots or rosettes to stars, this felid is considered as a celestial being and intrinsically linked to the idea of rebirth as well. So its association with the idea of renewal matches that of the bat perfectly. Tutankhamun's leonine bat is often addressed as Isis Mehetweret in the literature due to the text on the bat frame between the two heads. Again, you cannot see it, but it would be atop this board. This Isis Mehetweret, a goddess who would be attested only in this case, is generally again understood as a syncretistic deity composed of Isis and Mahit, so a lioness goddess. Yet the interpretation of the actual text is still debated, but I'm fairly sure that neither Isis nor Mahit have anything to do with this bet. So the first part of the inscription, what is generally interpreted as Isis or Aset, Eset in ancient Egyptian, actually reads Set. And Set means the place. But Set is also a term which is attested with the meaning bed, one actually of the oldest terms that were used to designate beds. And the second part, this Mehet, could be derived from Mehi, so to care for, maybe also Shadi as suggested by Horst Beinlich. So Shadi means to suckle or to educate. So whatever the exact meaning, the bed would be named something as the place or even the bed of caring or the like. This might now seem like an unusual name for a goddess, but then we should bear in mind that Hathor, for instance, means house of Horus. So again, kind of a more abstract word or kind of an architectural part of some sort referring to the goddess. And again, Hathor doesn't sound like your common name either. So whatever the exact meaning of the name in this case, the leonine bed is a place in which the sleeper deceased rests and is taken care of by a motherly figure. And when we now look at some of the other New Kingdom scenes in which the leonine bed occurs, this makes sense. So in scenes in which Anubis tends to the mummy lying on the bed, as here this scene from the tomb of Sennacherib, or also Isis and Nephthys standing around the bed mourning the deceased, is not finished yet. Otherwise, Isis and Nephthys would have nothing to mourn about, or Anubis would not need to stand around. So the process in that case is still ongoing. So the leonine bed, at least in the New Kingdom, is the marker for a process that is still ongoing. And this is probably also the reason why the leonine specimen is depicted more frequently than other bed types, as most of the reliefs and paintings show this process of transformation, of transition, and not the end result. So like Taweret Amit corresponded to the rite of separation, the lioness represents the rite of transition, so the liminal space itself, the time in which the son, and by extension the sleeper deceased, moves through the body of the mother goddess. Now, the last bed of Tutankhamun's triad represents a cow, which is identified by the accompanying inscription as Mehetweret, so the great flood, the cow that rose from the primordial ocean at the beginning of time. And this is basically the only picture I could find on which you can at least glimpse the hieroglyphic text between the heads. So here, I hope you can see this kind of raised, or not raised, but the kind of hieroglyphs. Of course, there's glass lying on top, so it reflects a bit. But this is where in all three cases, the text stands. And it's really frustrating. I've never seen an actual picture of the text themselves, because in all the books, of course, you have pictures from the front, you have pictures from the sides, but people generally were not interested in these details. And of course, these details for me are absolutely essential. So I had to work with the copies from Carter's team, so the tomb cards they made, but also there's this corpus by Beinlich and Seller where the hieroglyphs are typed. So again, whether there would have been anything else in these hieroglyphs themselves, I cannot say. But I hope that maybe one day, maybe in the gem, it will be able to actually see these inscriptions as well. But let us come back to Mehetweret. Mehetweret is one of the goddesses that give birth to the sun god, whom she carries between her horns to the sky. And actually, these sun discs between the horns symbolize this. And when you would have placed Tutankhamun as a mummy atop the back, you have the two suns, so one between the horns and Tutankhamun taking the place as well of the sun carried on her back. So it is certainly no coincidence that Mehetweret is represented here, as I said, with the sun between her horns, because that is what she do. And sometimes she also has a depiction of the sun child sitting between her horns, grabbing onto the horns while being carried by her. And as I mentioned in the contents of the panther, the spots of the felines here, so these trefoils, glass trefoils, are likened to stars as well. So again, the cow in this case is characterized as a celestial being. Moreover, in the case of the heavenly cow, so this bat and its specific function represent the rite of reintegration, so the post-liminal sphere and the rebirth itself, hinting at the successful outcome of the process as a whole. Of course, I say outcome of the process, or I say end result, but actually this is not true. This is a preliminary end point, because the whole rebirth of the sun, just like the whole rebirth of the sleeper deceased, is cyclical. So it is meant to happen every single day, because it's not about dying and being reborn and then you're happy. No, you want to be rejuvenated constantly, just like the sun. Moreover, what is also interesting, Mehetweret is closely related to Neith in this role, which is described in the text of the heavenly cow as removing the aging sun god on her back to the sky and thus rejuvenating him. So I don't know if you know the story, but this is the story of the revolt of the revolt of mankind against the elderly sun god, who sends his daughter to basically slay humankind. But then he feels sorry, he makes her drunk with colored beer or wine, so that she stops, but still he cannot forgive mankind. And he asks Neith in the form of a cow to remove him to the sky. And actually, I believe that it is not a coincidence that the oldest version of this text is found on the outermost of Tutankhamun's shrines. So the shrines, and this outermost shrine, I believe, was used in combination with this bovine bed. So this is something I cannot go into detail here. That would be, again, take far longer. But Tutankhamun has 4 shrines, and he has 4 funerary ritual beds, and each bed corresponds to a shrine. So the shrine, again, adding to the overall meaning. So when I talk about the meaning of these beds, I also consider the meaning of the shrines and the meaning of the shrines in connection with the beds. And actually, this Mehetweret shrine, this Mehetweret bed would have been used with the bed on which this story of the heavenly cow was written. And interesting as well in this particular case of Tutankhamun, so in the text itself, also in the other versions, we have the cow is always addressed as Neith. So she's the heavenly cow. Yet the accompanying text on this particular shrine of Tutankhamun, so the text accompanying the vignette calls her Mehetweret, and this is the only case that the name Mehetweret was added to this depiction of the heavenly cow. So this text or this addition does not just create the visual link, but also the textual link between the bed and the shrine. So it should be considered as a whole, which is not often done, but we should see things in connection to each other. We cannot just look at one type of object and ignore everything else that always comes with it. So even though the whole process of this regeneration process of this rebirth is divided amongst 3 beds, so amongst 3 goddesses, in the case of Tutankhamun, the ties with the old kingdom traditions of Neith as the heavenly bed are still tangible. So it's not that it's completely different, it's just a further development that we can observe. So the role of the bed, whether old kingdom, whether new kingdom, is based on the exact same ideas. As mentioned, such ritual beds did not only occur in the tomb of Tutankhamun. In the tomb of Seti I, in a side room next to the burial chamber marked here in red, 8 ritual beds were depicted, 4 on each side. Unfortunately, as you can see here, they are rather fragmented at the moment. As one side is an exact mirror image of the other, we can assume that the actual sequence represented here consists of 4 beds on each side. So again, the series starts on top here. So this would be here with this Amit bed or Taweret Amit bed, followed by a leonine and eventually a bovine bed. Particularly interesting is, however, that we have a 4th bed on each side, namely a 2nd leonine bed. And well, you can here see the tail. Here you can see a bit more. And I'll show you here, so these are the 2 beds, the leonine beds from this side in a bit more detail. Well, as much as I can show you based on what is left. So whereas the first feline bed in this sequence is painted in yellow, the frame of the second one is black. So they are distinguished from each other in some way. As the bed is a vehicle of solar rejuvenation, as we have seen, one might actually wonder whether these 2 leonine beds were meant to correspond to the day and the night bark of the sun. And there are actually many links between the solar bark and the beds, which again would be a different talk. But just believe me when I say there are links. And at least the fact that the leonine bed was related to the solar bark is clear from depictions like this one that show a boat directly standing atop the bed. And in this example, we see Anubis in this kind of typical tending to the mummy scene, just that we have a bark in between the mummy and the bed, which is unusual. But again, considering the overall discussion we just had, it's not surprising, because bed and boat and this whole idea of the solar journey is kind of linked to the beds, is associated with the beds. However, for this 2nd leonine bed in the case of Seti, there might be another explanation. And for that, we should return to the tomb of Tutankhamun. Because Tutankhamun had a 2nd leonine bed as well. And again, this is not an everyday bed, this is a funerary ritual bed. Because as also with the long-legged ones, you don't have webbing. So this is just kind of carved into the top of the bed, because comfort was of no issue. So you don't need anything comfortable to sleep upon. So these beds are meant to be purely funerary. And interesting also is that this bed is generally addressed as a bier, and kind of creating this separation between this bier and the so-called couches. So these long-legged beds we have discussed before. And this is a kind of a separation that we already have with Carter. So since the very beginning, since the tomb carts, they are put into these different categories as if they don't belong together. Now, this bed in particular was found carrying the king's 3 anthropomorphic coffins within his rectangular stone sarcophagus. The bed is, of course, much sturdier than the other 3, as it needed to carry far, far more weight. Just as an example, the inner coffin alone weighed around 110 kilos. So it really needed to carry a lot of weight. And you can actually see here kind of how deformed in a way it already got, because the bed, the coffins really or literally weighed the bed down. Nonetheless, I think it's amazing that it still actually stands, that it was not broken or anything. And so when we now visualize this bed with the coffins, the anthropomorphic coffins standing atop of it, we actually have the same scene we have already seen in the case of Sennacherib, for instance, when Anubis tends to the mummy on the leonine bed. This is kind of the same image we have, or the same image that was created. And the question, of course, arises now what the exact meaning of this particular bed was, and what the relationship between the object and the long-legged exemplars might have been, if there was a relationship at all. So we have seen that the 3 long-legged ritual beds were used during the funerary rites happening before the actual burial. So I actually believe that there was some sort of movement, not just the symbolic movement we have in the tomb, but there was actually a movement from Tutankhamun's temple, his mortuary or memorial temple, towards his tomb. So each bed would have been used in a different station, so to speak. So similar to boat processions. And the interesting thing is, especially with the Leonine bed, because it has inlaid eyes, I wonder whether these inlaid eyes were meant to actually work in connection with the sun directly, because they would have reflected the sunlight. But how exactly they were used, we don't know, but they must have been used before. Because also when you look at how Carter got these beds out, he had to dismantle them. There was no way he could fit them through the door. So it's of course likely that the priests carrying these beds to the tomb would not have been able to fit them through as well. And inside the tomb, there was just no space. So they must have been used somewhere outside. But again, how exactly, we don't know. So after these pre-burial rites, these beds were deposited then in the antechamber, and they seemingly did not play any active role once in the tomb. Contrary to those, though, the short-leg bed had a crucial function, not just before the burial, but during and especially also afterwards, because it was meant to carry the king and his coffins for all of eternity. So I believe that this bed acts as a sort of abbreviation for the whole regeneration process, in a way a past prototype, because the Leonine bed represents the most iconic moment of the whole ritual, of the whole of the actual rebirth journey. So these objects, the so-called long-legged couches and the short-legged bier, in my opinion, actually go together and form a whole group. And this whole group we see in the tomb of Seti I as well. And this fact that they belong together is often obfuscated by our modern choice of terms. And that's one of the issues I mentioned at the beginning. We really have to be careful with the modern terms we use, because words are never neutral. And in a way, sometimes by the words we choose, we create our own problems, where there would not be any problems if we would be a bit more careful, maybe. So I also think, to come back to the Leonine bed in general, that the reason that this bed is the most frequently found in the royal tombs, but also especially in the non-royal tombs, is this idea that it is actually a pars pro toto for the whole journey. And it should also be mentioned that it seems that in the New Kingdom, at least, the other beds are a prerogative of the king. So it seems that non-royal individuals were not allowed to have any of these. We have one example of the group from burial in the Valley of the Queen, so a QV40. We don't know who's buried there, maybe a king, maybe a royal heir or prince of some sort. We don't know, but this is the only example that we have outside the Valley of the Kings. So the three-partite pattern being a prerogative of the king, the non-royals were allowed to use the Leonine bed, and therefore it was the most iconic in a way. And one such example of a Leonine bed in a non-royal context is the bed that was found in the tomb of Sennacherib, so the same Sennacherib mummy. And this bed, again, was especially made for the funerary context, as it does not have any webbing, nor any fixture to attach the webbing. Like most other funerary beds, it is painted white, probably to reflect the object's purity or ritual purity. The inscriptions referring to Sennacherib characterize him as already deceased, which is another hint at the fact that the bed is purely funerary. When the tomb was opened, the anthropomorphic coffin of Khonsu, so Sennacherib's son, stood atop this bed, thus again recreating in a way the situation encountered in the aforementioned royal tombs. After all, the people of Dar Medina would have been very aware of what was going on in the royal tombs, because they were the ones building and creating these tombs and also equipping. Moreover, when the bed was found, so as mentioned, so the bed, the coffin of Sennacherib's sons was standing on top when it was found. And as such, again, it presented itself to the discoverers of the tomb in the very same way as this famous scene I showed you before. And this was rendered on the side of one of the tomb, so on one side, and on the other side we had a similar scene. Just instead of Anubis, we had Isis and Nephthys in their kite form sitting around the bed mourning. So the actual bed would have stood exactly between those two scenes, and these two scenes kind of like the bed or the deceased atop this bed would take the place of the depiction of the mummy or the coffin on these walls. So kind again of like an eternalization of these rituals that are again meant to happen cyclically. So actual burial and decoration represent an absolute unity. Nothing was coincidental in my opinion. Interesting when it comes to Sennacherib's beds are also the two yellow snakes painted atop the white frame. When the coffin stood atop the bed, they would have protectively surrounded the sleeper deceased, just like the snake Manon surrounds the sun god in the underworld, where the goddess is standing atop his bark. And again, as I said, I really think there's this relationship between beds and the solar bark, which again is also found in this decoration. So as in the case of Tutankhamun, the non-elite person would also assume, again, the place of the sun god himself, wishing to rejuvenate it on a daily basis. Now, after the New Kingdom, things changed, even though it is hard to grasp these changes due to the scarcity of the evidence. The Taweret Amit bed, for instance, seems to completely disappear, maybe because Taweret and also Amit changed their appearance and become more and more close to each other. So there was potentially too dangerous to place the sleeper deceased on the back of a creature that could harm him. Another observation that is worth mentioning is that the post-New Kingdom period, that there happened some sort of Osirification, so everything is kind of reinterpreted to fit this Osirian context. So for instance, now, and only now, Isis can be found in the role of the bed, carrying and hence protecting her husband. In the Greco-Roman period, we also find the Klinae, so the aforementioned bed couches of the Greco-Roman world in the typical Egyptian funerary bed scenes, probably adding new and different aspects to an already well-established meaning. So beds are very important throughout the whole of ancient Egyptian history, even though their meaning is never static. There are constant changes and developments, adapting the bed to the shifting landscape of the surrounding belief systems. Yet their connection to the mother goddesses and the cyclical solar rebirth is tangible throughout all the periods. So much for the beds in the funerary context. So now I would like to briefly talk about thrones as promised. So beds are older than chairs and as such older than thrones as well. And they were not just used to lie upon, to sleep upon, but also as seating opportunity. A nice example which illustrates this is actually the bed shown in the tomb of Mereruka from Dynasty 6. In this scene, the tomb owner sits on his leonine-like bed while his wife, sitting at the foot of the bed, plays the harp for him. This depiction shows a couple enjoying their time together, just like we would maybe enjoy watching TV while sitting on the bed. So using the bed as a place for social encounter and leisure. After all, sitting on the bed was probably more comfortable than just sitting on another piece of furniture or on the floor. Of course, this scene also has a clear erotic connotation, evoking not only sexual activity per se, using the bed as a symbol, but also images of fertility and procreation in this as well as the next life. Nonetheless, what I want to show you with this example is that the bed in ancient Egypt is actually a multi-purpose object since its very beginning and a focal point of social activity, but also hierarchy. Moreover, this use as seating opportunity in connection with the fact that they literally elevate people above others makes them the perfect status symbol of power and symbol of authority. So in a way, beds and thrones are thrones since the beginning. This has, of course, not just to do with my imagination, but it is also reflected in the ancient Egyptian language, in which the term set, so the same term we have encountered with the leonine bed of Tutankhamun, the set Mehetweret, refers to thrones as well as beds in the early times. So this intrinsic connection between the two pieces of furniture is still tangible also in the language until the Greco-Roman period. In these late times, we have even more terms that designate beds as well as thrones at the same time, and we generally translate them either as the one or the other. So choosing the term that would fit best in a specific context, again, according to our own worldview. But did the ancient Egyptians really make this same distinction, or were the objects used in the very same context as we would use them nowadays? So one of my favorite examples, which I think illustrates this point quite nicely, is a text from the Horus temple in Edfu, known as Knowing the Day of the Birth of Horus. There it is described how Seth, so the god who is generally known for having murdered his brother Osiris, sleeps peacefully atop his Semmat. However, the very moment that Horus, so Osiris's son, was born, this Semmat starts shaking. Due to the activity of sleeping and Horus being born during the night, this Semmat is generally interpreted as a bed. Yet, since Horus's mere existence as the avenger of his father and rightful heir threatens not just Seth's sleep, I mean, maybe he could not sleep afterwards, yes, but it actually threatens his actual kingship. And this kingship is symbolized by the Semmat, which would then rather be a throne. But could this Semmat actually be some sort of bed throne? This idea of a bed throne might seem unusual at first, but when we look at other cultures and into different interesting in this context is, for instance, the so-called garden relief of Ashurbanipal. The main scene shows Ashurbanipal lying atop a kline-like bed. So, and here you can see the headboard as opposed to the footboard of ancient Egyptian beds. And he's lying there while drinking from a bowl. His wife sits next to him on a chair or throne, likewise sipping from a bowl. Even though Ashurbanipal lies down, there's no doubt whatsoever that he represents the highest form of authority in this context. This impression is further highlighted by the fact that the kline elevates him above everyone else and also above the queen. So lying in this case exudes far more authority and power than sitting. Moreover, of course, this power is also stressed by the fact that the head of his enemy, so the king of Elam, hangs in one of the trees. So this is not a mere peaceful banquet scene, but it is highly loaded. The bed truly becomes a platform displaying the power and authority of Ashurbanipal, a scene for his political theater. Another example far removed in time is the Sun throne, the imperial throne of Iran, which was constructed in the early 19th century. Since 1980, it is displayed in the central bank of Iran amongst the Iranian crown jewels. Again, we have a structure that is reminiscent of a bed, yet acts as a throne in our modern Western sense. So the boundaries between the two pieces of furniture are once more blurred. Interesting in this context is also that the Persian Shah, seated on this structure, would have had this disc, this sun disc behind his head. So he was not only just seen as the lion of Persia, but he was in particular seen as the sun himself. So there are some parallels with the ancient Egyptian understanding of the king, but of course, I'm not saying it is the exact same thing. I'm just saying there's some parallels. As a last example, I want to show you the bed throne of the Ethiopian emperors, here with the Empress Sauditu sitting in front of it, sitting on it. Interesting in this case is that it shows that this idea of a bed throne is not only tied to the frame, but also includes blankets and pillows, just as in the case of an actual bed in our sense where we would sleep. So these accessories, again, being an important factor of the whole construct. And as mentioned, these are just a few examples, but I hope that they have shown you that the line between bed and throne is not as strict as our modern worldview would suggest. Of course, it should be highlighted that I'm not saying that the ancient Egyptian understanding of these pieces of furniture are the exact same as in Persia or Ethiopia, but I think that such ethnographic comparison help us to identify our own biases of understanding and open our mind to other interpretations. We have seen that the ancient Egyptian language suggests that beds and throne belong to the same object category, and this might also be reflected in the fact that they often share similar decoration. Here I show you the back of the bed that is usually attributed to Yuya, the father-in-law of Amenhotep III. The footboard shows 3 panels with bees in different poses, as well as one's Taweret. These deities are often found in connection with birth and rebirth, in the funerary as well as the domestic context, scaring away evil forces with their appearance as well as sounds that they produce. After all, noise is a powerful deterrent. In this case, I want to point out that Bes is playing the tambour in particular, with which he is musically accompanying the daily rebirth of the sun, and by extension, the sleeper who would have slept on this bed. After all, the victorious sun rising again in the morning needed to be greeted and needed to be celebrated accordingly. So in a way, the decoration of this bed already anticipates and positively influences the successful waking up again of the sleeper, in this case, Yuya. Now, in the same tomb of Yuya and Tuya, the chair or throne of their granddaughter Sitamun was deposited as well. Again, as in the case of the footboard of the bed, we find the depictions of Bes and Taweret on the outside of the armrests, so the 2 entities that often occur in the context of birth and rebirth, as I have already mentioned. Also, Bes takes up his role as musician again and as celebrator. Hence, we have a very similar, if not to say the same motive appearing on the bed as well as the chair or throne. Now, does this mean that their symbolic meaning might have been related as well? When we apply the meaning of the beds as discussed before onto the chairs and thrones, these pieces of furniture might likewise assume the role of the mother goddess involved in the daily renewal of the sun. Thus, the king seated atop the throne, and as such may be seated atop the sky, the object, again being reminiscent of the celestial platform, is likened to the sun or sun god, who is reborn and rejuvenated on a daily basis. So the throne becomes the guarantor, the enabler of his daily rejuvenation, renewal process. So just by sitting on the throne or ceremonial chair, the pharaoh and his powers would symbolically be rejuvenated every day like those of Re. But of course, in conjunction with beds, the renewal symbolism would not just be due to the similarity with beds in form and decoration, but also the presence of the mother goddess. For this reason, it might be possible that the lions decorating the thrones, as in the case of this statue of Khafre, but also the throne of Tutankhamun, represent once more the fierce goddess who not only protects her child, but also guarantees their successful rebirth on a daily basis. Traditionally, these lions have always been interpreted as mere representatives of royal animals, and that might still be true, but I think that there's far more to these animals than meets the eye, a very different level of understanding. So they are essential in the protection and preservation of the king and thus kingship more generally. And if we interpret these lions as representatives of the mother goddess, this might also explain why they can be replaced by female heads, as in the case of the chair of Sitamun, or entire female figures in some cases, especially in the New Kingdom. These places before the armrests are always occupied by royal women, so either the mothers, the wives, or the daughters of the king, effectively replacing the more typical or maybe more traditional lions. So one might wonder whether the royal women likewise symbolize the mother goddess in these cases, not just protecting the pharaoh, but also guaranteeing and ensuring his cyclical daily rebirth, as mentioned. Seen from this point of view, women played a far more important, a far more active role in the ritual preservation and renewal of the king than generally thought. They are literally the pillars that elevate and carry the kingship, and hence represent an indispensable factor in the preservation of kingship, but also in the daily rebirth of the sun, and hence the survival of Egypt as such. And on this note, we have reached the end of my talk today. You aware of our own biases when it comes to something apparently as normal, apparently as familiar as a bed and or throne. Moreover, I hope that you were able to catch a glimpse of the world of these ancient Egyptian pieces of furniture and their meaning, especially also in connection with female entities, with the mother goddesses. Even though ancient Egypt was focused on men, so male gods, and especially also the king, the examples of beds and thrones show the absolute importance of the women, so the mothers, the wives, the daughters, for the survival of the king, the survival of the institution of kingship, for the survival of Egypt as such, but also the continued existence in the afterlife. So even though the human and divine women often acted in the shadows, their role, their influence, and their power should not be underestimated. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Manon. That was absolutely fascinating. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box or to unmute yourself. That was so interesting. There were lots of things that were really inspiring in that talk, especially this relationship with the idea of the sky platform and the bed representing a kind of 3D representation of the pet, the sky platform. So that was fascinating. And I wanted to ask you, let me just have a look through my notes. It seems to me as well, like the throne itself, the actual sort of material construction of the throne reflects this idea and this image of the Neith, which is a very ancient image of usually a goddess or can be a god holding or dominating two often feline creatures. Do you think that that is something that's been incorporated into the throne from cultures predating Egypt?
I mean, so the problem in general we don't really know what was going on in pre-early dynastic times. So the symbolism as such might be also different, and there might have been influences from outside. And I think what happens with ancient Egyptian motifs of furniture, I think most of them are multi-layered in understanding. So one thing does not exclude another. So understanding sketch put one atop the other. So now I was presenting, of course, this through this lens of the bed as a female entity, but we also have, especially later on, this idea. So we have this doubling of the carrier animal. So Heteparis was one animal, so you have 4 feet because there's no head, so there was no need to double. But as soon as you add heads and tails, you double. And of course, it's still this one goddess, but you have a different layer that comes on top, namely these 2 lions of the horizon. And that, so for us very often we think it's either or. But I think that's an understanding that you would not necessarily find in ancient Egypt as such. Sometimes it's and, not either or. Yeah. So there's also this, I mean, there are so many levels of understanding when it comes to beds. There's also this connection of beds and doors. So again, and therefore, as soon as you have the door, you have the achet, which in fact is a door. You have the lions as well protecting this door. So, and I think in many cases, also with the thrones, there are many different layers of understanding that come together to create a whole. Yeah.
I was watching a documentary recently, the one that Curtis Ryan Woodside made about the 2 stillborn baby mummies that were discovered in Tutankhamun's tomb. Were they found in any context relating to beds, or do you know anything about their placement in the tomb?
No, I don't think they were found in connection with beds. But then the question is also, I mean, this is a general question we always have in Egyptology as well. At what age are children seen as individuals? And at what age would they have been buried in the exact same context as adults? Or I mean, it's always a bit difficult because I think one they think might have been actually born, but the other one already died then. But that's, I have to say, it's not really my area. But this week on Monday, I actually presented at the conference in Cairo, Living in the House.
Yeah.
Which you can watch online on the IFO channel if you're interested. And there I was testing my results from the funerary sphere on the everyday life beds. And beds, of course, we have in the context of sleeping, but we also have them in the context of this ostraka showing the so-called birth arbor.
Yeah.
So women did not give birth while lying on the bed. They were squatting. We have similar kind of proceeding also, for instance, in ancient China. They had kind of a tent outside. They had a bed, but would give birth squatting.
Yeah.
But if there were complications, they would go and lie on the bed, and we could maybe imagine something similar. But the bed as such is not a birth bed. But I think that these beds are connected to the funerary beds as well, because I don't assume that every bed in every context had a completely different meaning. I really believe they were interlinked. And I think so the mother, we know, for instance, from Papyrus Westcar, had to go through a purification phase of 14 days. And I actually kind of raised the theory that the child is also in a liminal space in that time, because most of the children, or a lot of the children, died within the first days, if not the first hours. And actually between 10 and 14 days, it takes for them to lose the rest of the umbilical cord. And we know from religious texts that, for instance, Apophis is the umbilical cord of Ra. So maybe it's only at the moment that they lose all the umbilical cords that they kind of leave this kind of liminal space. I don't know, it's just a theory, and I need to do more research on that. But this would mean that the fetuses of Tutankhamun might have been died already in a liminal space. So I'm not sure how that would have maybe changed the understanding of how they should be buried. But then again, I'm not sure how they were found. I think were they
well, they're both thought to have been stillbirths. One I think about 6 months, and one much earlier, because one's very tiny and one's a bit bigger. There's really, in that documentary, he speaks to Dr. Saha Salim, and she's done lots of CT scans and has done lots of new research into it. So it's very interesting. There's a lot of facts in that documentary. And they have very elaborate little coffins and mummification procedures that they've undergone. They don't have any names, which is perhaps, you know, it relates to what you're talking about in terms of them not being considered in the realm of the living quite. And that, I think, I don't know whether both of their mummies or the box is labeled with the Osiris. So it just has that word on it. So let me just have a look. Arthur says, yeah, the 2 fetuses were found in a box on the top of a pile of other things in the treasury. So yeah. And Angela asks, I have questions about the headrests. When they had pillows, blankets and everything else, did they really sleep with headrests, or were the headrests more for holding the head of a mummy?
So I think in general, I always say sleep is universal, but the way we sleep is not. So, and I think it's also the same with ancient Egyptians. I think they used headrests also in everyday life. So there's one headrest that was found in situ on the Kol in Deir Medina. So it's a massive stone block. Of course, they might have put some sort of pillow or cushion of whatever type on it to sleep. But this one really suggests they were used. Most of the headrests we have, of course, this kind of like super beautiful headrests. They are really like flimsicle, like they seem to break as soon as you would touch them. And I think those are, again, purpose made for the funerary context. Yeah. But I know of people who have tried headrests because, again, the ancient Egyptians are not the only ones to ever use headrests. So we have a lot of African cultures who used and still use them. In China, in Japan, you have headrests as well, although in a slightly different context. But people were actually sleeping on that. I think it's just because we are so not used to sleep on something like that, we just can't imagine it being comfortable. But there are people who think pillows are absolutely torture because it's too soft. So they're like very different. And it really depends on how you grew up, how you were used, or to what you have been used. And actually, yes, we find headrests a lot again in this in this funerary sphere, because I think, as I said, beds are really a status symbol. They would have been very expensive, and not everyone would have been able to use them. I think actually the headrest is kind of an abbreviation for the bed, and they share the symbolism. So if you could not have a bed,
I guess like the whereas amulet is a kind of example of that, isn't it? Because it's in its amuletic form, it represents the eternal sleep of the deceased.
Yeah, and headrests also are connected to the solar rebirth. So the head, in fact, so you as a person are connected to the sun, but it's in particular also the head, because when you sleep and you get up in the morning, your head rises first. So the headrest is also kind of has this solar meaning, and it's kind of like, again, giving you maybe also like a symbolic push in the morning to make sure that you get up.
So the headrest itself is the hieroglyph of the mountains, and then your head is the sun rising above the horizon. Yeah, I think it was Glen Carn Museum did a lot of studies into actually sleeping with the headrests, and I'll send everyone the link to that. It was quite interesting. And places like the Pitt Rivers Museum have an amazing collection of headrests from all over the world there, actually. And like you say, they are used still to this day. And then in the Glen Carn Museum, because I always envisaged headrests, because you see them in the funerary context quite often, that people are sleeping on the back on them, in which case, yeah, that would be incredibly uncomfortable, but usually they'll be padded and sleeping on the side.
So generally sleeping would have happened on the side. So we have depictions, but again, so of course, some people would have slept on the sides, some on the back. I mean, that would have changed just like nowadays. So the sideways so-called fetal position is the most common sleeping position all over the world, not just nowadays, but also in ancient Egypt. And we know, for instance, from Osiris, who's the sleeper, like the archetypical sleeper. So he's dead, but you don't say he's dead. He's sleeping. He's the wary one. He's the tired one. And it always says he should turn to his left side and get up. So, and of course, in pre-early dynastic Egypt, we have mummies lying on the side. We also still have them in the Old Kingdom in a crouched position. Then they stretch up to the Middle Kingdom, but they're still lying on the left side. So it's only much, much later that they would be turned on the back. So, and in that case, of course, when you imagine the mummy lying on the side, you need a headrest, because otherwise the head might fall off. And in a lot of cases, the head actually did fall off. And I think, and we have that also in a lot of the texts where they are worried about the neck, where they have this, by textual means, trying to give like extra strength to the neck, because I think that was the weak link, the weak position, because it broke maybe more than we might imagine. And of course, that's all related. You don't want the head to fall off because you need it.
Arthur would love the link for the Cairo lectures. So can you send us the link to that?
I can do that.
Yeah, so, if you send that to me, and then I'll send it out to everyone with the video, because otherwise we'll lose it in the chat.
So basically it's on the Ether.O channel.
Okay.
But I can send you the link.
Yeah, excellent. And then the other thing I wanted to ask is, you mentioned the Kline, and in the context of Asclepian sanctuaries, that was related to dream incubation quite often and receiving divine dreams. And this was like the sacred bed where you would receive a visitation from the god. So is there context there in terms of a special bed for dreaming on?
So from a purely Egyptian context, not that I would know of. I mean, with dreaming is quite interesting, because you have this kind of thing that death is a form of sleep since the pre-dynastic. I'm convinced that these beds in the pre-dynastic, although we don't have the text, represents death as sleep. But since the New Kingdom at the latest, we have texts saying that sleep is a form of death. So when you sleep, you go to the underworld, and there in this underworld, you meet people that have already passed away, and you can talk to them and you can interact with them. You see demons, and this is actually because of what you dream and your ability to dream. So in your dream, you see things that are not of this world. So and that's probably why sleep can be seen as a form of death. And then in the morning, you are supposed to wake up much more refreshed, which at least in my case doesn't really happen often. But in theory, you feel much more refreshed in the morning. So that's your rebirth in a way.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, in Mesopotamia, I know there was this idea of having nightmares shortening your life and diminishing your life force. And I wonder if that existed in Egypt as well. It seems like a fairly universal concept.
I mean, nightmares is always because you kind of cross the boundaries. And also the Egyptian word for dream is actually to wake. So it was not seen as something that's just a dream, but
is it rasut? Rasut is the Egyptian word for dream, and the determinative is the open eye, so it's seeing things.
And again, because in the sleep, and you have to be asleep to dream generally. So when you sleep is kind of like crossing this boundary, again, going to this liminal sphere, to this liminal space, and that it's what you see. So of course, there's also, I mean, this is general fear of dying in your sleep. Which I mean, I have read a lot on sleep, but actually most people die around 11 in the morning. So it's not really kind of like something that's medically proven, but it's this innate fear, I think, of everyone to die while you sleep, because the night you're vulnerable. And it's also the time where the most crimes would happen. It's also where people would imagine, especially around midnight with all the witches and the ghosts and the revenants, they need the darkness. So it's this fear. And in some African cultures, actually, we have this thinking that your soul leaves the body while you sleep. So it's, of course, soul aspect is really difficult in ancient Egypt. We don't have that as we understand soul. But some part of the sleeper goes to the underworld as well. And some of these African cultures think that your soul goes to the underworld, but it needs to return before you wake up, because if it doesn't return on time, you die. And I wonder,
when I was a teenager, I think it was after watching Friday the 13th or something, this idea that if you died in a dream, you would die in real life. I wonder if there was this idea in ancient Egypt.
Maybe. I mean, it's really hard to grasp. I don't know.
Weird. The idea, I would imagine the ideal now is dying in your sleep, because at least then you don't have to go through pain, or you know, it's like it's the dream death these days, to die old age peacefully in your sleep. And I wonder whether in Egypt that wasn't the case, because you wouldn't then have the opportunity to go through all the necessary stages of conscious death. I don't know.
I mean, well, to be fair, I think when you think about the deaths that we know of in ancient Egypt, maybe dying in your sleep was not that bad. I mean, yeah, some of the mummies didn't have that peaceful death. So yeah, I don't know.
It might be a good reason for why you practice death in the dream state as well. You know, if you're entering the underworld in dreams, then you're already there and you're hopefully conscious of it. What's the other thing I was going to ask you about? Oh yeah, so I wonder whether this idea of, if the bed is this sky platform, that kind of exploring that liminal realm takes us closer to the sky gods and less towards the underworld, maybe, if this is this celestial connection with sleeping.
So I think, I mean, the word underworld is really tricky in Egyptology in ancient Egypt, because so you have this kind of creation, and then you have the sky, and you have the counter sky, and they are connected. So it's not like the sky and then you have earth, and that they are not connected at all. They actually go all around. So like the noon goes all around, and the sky the sky is a watery milieu. So for us, it's a very different understanding, but the sky is water, therefore the sun can also travel by bark, but it's this cycle. So going to the sky, the underworld, it's all connected. And of course, in the pyramid text, you have this kind of skyward movement more clearly expressed. But this kind of cycle of the sun, it's of course, it's not just linked to the sky, what we think of as sky, but also the travel through the counter sky, through the underworld. So it's kind of, it belongs together. It's not as separate as we generally assume, again, because of the terminology.
Yeah. Let's have a look. Well, everyone seems to have very much enjoyed that lecture. Would anyone like to unmute themselves and ask Manon a question themselves? Let me just...
I was wondering, have you published your research?
Not yet. But I hope to in the maybe not so distant future.
I would certainly like to read it.
Really happy to hear.
So I shall wait until you publish. And
she's been sleeping on the job. I don't know.
But thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk.
Thank you. Really happy. I mean, I'm always happy when someone is interested in my research.
Yeah, no, I've thoroughly enjoyed that. It just is a really fascinating exploration of something that we just take for granted, you know, getting into bed every day. And I think this is something that I talk about a lot with relation to the ancient Greek sleep temples and this idea of the kline is it's not like a bed that we get into. It's not a bed to just go to sleep for the night. And even like you were saying, although sleep is universal, it's only probably very recently that we've started sleeping 8 hours a night, and we've probably had more polyphasic sleep patterns before then. And to understand how vulnerable people might have felt at nighttime is very difficult for us these days, I think, for the most part. So yeah, really I always think it's amazing to consider these the kind of perception of the world around people in these times when they obviously didn't have ever-present light like we do these days, or some of the sort of comforts that we take for granted.
Yeah, I think that makes a huge difference, because again, we just know what we have experienced, but without electricity, I mean, all these fears of the night would have been far more threatening than they are now. And I mean, even as a child, like when because I had to get up to turn off the light, and then I was running back into bed, and in my bed I felt safe. Yeah. Because the darkness was creeping all around. So, and I think that would have been far more palpable in these times. And I mean, also with this polyphasic sleep, I mean, there are people like Kirch who say we had this biphasic sleep. That would have been the natural way, because again, there are still cultures that don't have electricity, so anthropologists observing their sleep, and some of these cultures had like waking up in the night to do some reading, some sexual activities, or just meditating or whatever. And he thinks that's a more natural way of sleeping. But then there are also cultures who don't do that at all. So he has been really severely criticized as well. And again, I think in general, when it comes to sleep, there is nothing universal. There's nothing typical. It really depends where you're from, how you've been raised. And we cannot just assume, well, this is how it was, because maybe even then it was very different depending on where you lived. And of course, in areas, in places where you have a lot of differences in light between summer and winter time, people sleep more in winter because there's not much light, but also because of the cold. And this is generally like the first beds we have, what we would consider as beds, again, being multi-purpose, is in South Africa in caves dating around 70,000 years ago. So you have in the center your hearth, your fireplace, and then you would be all around. So it's the light, it's this feeling of safeness, but it's also the warmth, the heat that you need. And people actually think that at the very, very beginning, before humankind had fire, they slept on trees. A lot of the monkeys as well, or chimpanzees, so they would have kind of nests, because it was dangerous. But as soon as they had the fire, so they had the protection and they had the heat, they moved to the ground. So there's might be this link as well, but it's generally, it's innate in a way in us humans, because in the end we are animals. And it's also, you find the same behavior in animals. So they look for places, sleeping places where they feel safe. And now my dog goes next to the heater in winter and always sleeps next to the heater. But in summer, she sleeps in different places. But it's, again, it's this innate, or this kind of, I mean, for us, it's nothing we do like where we are very conscious about where we sleep, how we sleep. But there are these innate patterns that just unites us all. You want to feel safe, you want to feel warm in order to sleep. And also, like you mentioned, these movies, kind of horror movies, a lot turns around the bed as well.
Well, when I've interviewed Kasia Zapekowska. I don't know if you've come across Kasia's work before, but she specializes in dreams and nightmares in ancient Egypt. And she was saying that from a lot of the texts that she's read, it seems like sleep paralysis was quite prevalent in ancient Egyptian accounts of dream experiences. And I guess because there were concepts of dreams having real powers and having like demonic presence, that they were extra threatening, because they weren't viewed as being scary aspects of the personality coming out. They were viewed as demonic entities with their own volition. So you can imagine how terrifying that idea is. I mean, my friend is a anthropologist, and she's done some research into like various sort of myths and legends that have circulated in small communities where people have died with fright, believing that they're being possessed in the night and having terrifying sleep paralysis experiences, to the point where they're having heart attacks. So, these things have a lot of power if we believe them. Yeah.
And as I said, so they believed certainly that you went to the underworld and you saw all these, and of course they're potentially dangerous. And I mean, for us now, we know dreams happen, you have nightmares, and you wake up and think, okay, it was just a nightmare. But for people, this would not have always been the case. And I mean, this general fear of the night and nightmares, etc., you find it in so many cultures until rather recently as well. I mean, in Victorian times, they were afraid of the bad air coming into the bedrooms. So there were a lot of beliefs, again, surrounding beds and this fear of just dying in your sleep. And it manifested in different ways, in different areas. But it's something that you find so often for one or the other reason. So the reasons why are explained in different ways. But it's just this innate fear of the dark and this innate fear of not waking up again.
I mean, similarly, you also have, just because I don't want to give people nightmares, this idea of coming into contact with divine entities as well, and having ecstatic, blissful, often arousing dreams. I mean, there's definitely descriptions of wet dreams and erotic dreams in ancient Egyptian dream texts as well. So there is this idea that you enter into, like you were saying, the idea of this underworld is a bit limiting, and actually it's more of an other world where you have possibilities to meet not just the deceased but also divine beings. And especially I think it's the stela of Ipwi that describes an encounter with the goddess Hathor during the festival of drunkenness, where he's kind of drunk and he has this intoxicating vision of the beauty of Hathor, and he's joyous and he's so overwhelmed by that he decides to kind of immortalize this experience in stela as well. So hopefully everyone will have sweet dreams after this session. I mean, I am sleeping a lot more now that it's winter here. I find that I always kind of do sleep a lot more, and I love in the summertime though waking up with the sunrise. And I think that this is another element of ordinary ancient life that we forget about, is this relationship that people had to the sun, in terms of as soon as the sun rose, there was this sense of relief and joy and jubilation, and you could go about with your day and you were safe and you lived another day. And I wondered whether there was perhaps a greater sense of living in for the present moment, when you had this constant idea of the sun disappearing and being vulnerable, and then this rejuvenating experience every morning.
And I mean, we know from the great Aton hymn is when the sun is there, you live, and when the sun disappears, you die. Yeah. Of course, that's like bringing it to a point, but it exists outside of Akhenaten's religion as well. And actually, just on a side note, Akhenaten himself, his sarcophagus was placed atop a lion bed. So he had the bed as well. probably a different meaning connected to sleep and waking up. But I find it very interesting that he had a bed. Also in KV 55, there was a bed as well, wooden that style. So it's quite of interesting, because people always say it's so different, but I don't think so, because there just is some things they were so important as objects that they're found throughout.
Yeah, that was absolutely fantastic, so fascinating, and gives me lots of new avenues for me to explore in my own research as well. So I'm very grateful for that. Thank you so much, Manon. Any other last questions before we say goodbye?
Quick question.
Yep.
I'm interested in beds out of the funerary context, i.e. sort of more daily life. Just what percentage of the population would have actually had beds to sleep on?
So yeah, it depends on how you define beds. So most of the people
as an item of furniture, as opposed to just lying things on the ground, pillows and things on the ground.
Even a simple charpai bed, you mean?
Sorry?
Well, like a simple charpai bed that you showed us at the beginning of the pre-dynastic.
Yeah, so we have those also, these very simple beds in the New Kingdom. But again, as soon as it's wood, because I talked to von Stülpnagel, who's a conservator in Leipzig Museum, and he calls himself a furniture historian. So he knows more about the construction side of these things as well, something I just can't do. And he said, in order to do this type of beds, even if it's simple, you need someone experienced, you need different tools, it takes time. So there's this idea also that people would have had this kind of beds made of like palm fronds, which is much more easy to do, but that they just didn't survive, because also the sleeping mats and everything they would have actually have slept on, it just didn't survive. And what we have as actual objects are mostly the beds that were taken to tombs. So of course we have these royal beds, as in Tutankhamun. We have one bed in Amarna that was found in a domestic context. We have bits and pieces like these supports atop which beds would have been placed. We have sleeping niches, but the actual beds, we don't have many. And it's of course the question, well, first of all, not many would have been able to afford them. Maybe you would have given them to your son or your family when you died, so that not everyone took the bed with them. Actually, in some African cultures, the bed was inherited to the oldest son. So I showed you this Ethiopian example, and actually the crown prince was the prince of the bed because he inherited the bed. And in some of these African cultures, you would give your bed to your son, to your heir. In others, you would burn the bed because the bed was so closely connected to a specific person, being kind of the throne, this status symbol that you would burn and give it to onto the tomb. So the issue with ancient Egypt is we just don't know whether there would have been more beds, and they just didn't survive, considering that a lot might have gotten burned later, because when the first Egyptologists came in, they burned also coffins and stuff. But we still know that beds were also very sought after, because I don't know if you know the texts of Paneb, so this kind of thief of Dera Medina. And in the papyrus, it says that he actually stole the bed from underneath a mummy or underneath a coffin. So it is particularly mentioned. So that was something that you would actually also steal. What you would do after you've stolen it, the papyrus doesn't mention, but I thought it's particularly interesting. And again, highlighting how valuable a bed was, because again, only a very low percentage would have been able to afford one.
You'd have to be careful though, wouldn't you, who you invited back to your place, in case you got grassed up for having like a pharaoh's old bed in your bedroom. One question I wanted to ask before I forget is I did go for a phase of like putting the top of my bed on bricks to try and get that slope And I know there's a company that make beds with the ancient Egyptian slope. Have you ever tried sleeping on that incline? It's quite interesting.
I haven't tried myself, but I have read again in a book, a medical book. So it's actually healthier when you sleep in an incline with the head higher. Just so, because when you sleep different, like there might be like the blood rushing and the pressure rushing into your head. So it's healthier nowadays. And actually it's again a behavior that's also seen in animals. So they would sleep with their head being a bit higher, like kind of sloping.
Right, yeah.
Well. So it's again this kind of maybe innate behavior in some way.
Well, I guess it's kind of what we're trying to mimic when we use pillows, is having our head higher up than our feet. But with the bed itself on a slope, your spine has better alignment. And I think it's better for things like digestion and stuff like that as well.
Yeah. And that's
so I can recommend putting your bed on a bit of a slope. I think it's good.
So it's what they would recommend nowadays, that it's better. But I think there's also another of more symbolic understanding that comes in, that we know from later periods, again, different cultures. When you sleep flat, it's too death-like. So when you kind of like sleep up a bit with your head, it's kind of this symbolic push that you get up again in the morning. If you sleep flat, too death-like, and it's this fear of again not waking up. And
well, actually, when you have things like colds, it always feels better to be, I mean, I always used to do that with my daughter's bed. If she had a cold, it's like raise up the head end, because it helps you if you have difficulty breathing, if you're full of snot. So that's also quite useful. But yeah, I mean, I'll send you a link to this bed company, because they actually make beds in this style. I quite like the idea of that. So, and I think it has to be not too steep an incline, otherwise you can end up feeling a bit dizzy.
That's so weird, because I have bricks specifically under the foot of my bed, because I've always heard that it helps circulation.
Well, I think you can do a bit of both, can't you? If you do have circulatory issues, it's good to raise your especially in your legs, it's good to raise your legs. But I think in terms of sleeping through the night for things like digestion and breathing, it's good to be on a slight slope. I mean, I think you could do a bit of both. You know, you get these like V beds, don't you?
I think it depends on where the head is positioned. So you can get your legs up, but it doesn't mean that your head has to be down, because that would not be good. But you can, if you like, straight and then your legs up, that's fine because of the circulation. Actually,
having your bed too elevated would be like being buried at sea, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to go too mad, but it's definitely something worth experimenting with, I think. Yeah, a little bit of a slope is useful, I reckon. One thing I wanted to ask, one other thing that just popped into my head is this idea that you have in feng shui that your heads should be in a certain position, and I wonder whether they had something similar in terms of death. Did the head have to be facing a cardinal direction? Were we facing east or west, or towards the setting sun or at the rising sun?
I guess so. I know in feng shui is your feet cannot point to the door, because when you die you are brought out feet first. So you can't do that. In Egypt in general, like when you die, I mean, there's always this kind of ideal and then the actual placement, which are two different things. I mean, of course, there's a lot working with like a symbolic direction, but in theory, your head should be looking towards the east, because towards the rising sun, towards the world of the living, towards the place where the offerings are coming from. So we have, for instance, in the Old and in the Middle Kingdom, these coffins with the eyes on the side, and these should be aligned with the east.
I think that's the same in feng shui, that your bed position should be that your head's in the east and your feet are in the west, which does actually feel good feng shui to me, because I live parallel to the coastline, and it feels right to me to be facing with my head in the east and feet in the west. So
I mean, there's also this kind of thing that humans generally tend to position their bed that they can actually face a door, because the door, there's the potential threat, criminal or whatever coming in, so you would see that. So it's again something that happens not very consciously, but very often you are towards the possible origin of evil creatures or whatever.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something about what makes us feel comfortable, like a sort of natural comfort in space. One thing I can't stand is shelves above bed heads, or any like heavy paintings or mirrors above bed heads. I find that really peculiar, because it's like the sword of Damocles hanging over you all night. So whenever I see like interior design when there's like a heavy shelf right above the bed head, I always find that rather strange. And people don't generally like to be next to radiators or next to windows where their bed is either, because you get that sense that, you know, the window could smash, or, you know, you'll get too hot in the night. So I think there's definitely something to be said for feng shui in the bedroom, I think. Yeah. Well, that was brilliant, Manon. Thank you so much. I won't ask you any more questions. I could probably go on all night, but I'll leave you to get on with your own sleep and your own sweet dreams. And thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. And thank you everyone for coming along. And as I said, this is the last in our Feminine Power series for 2022. We're going to do a session. I don't know if you lot know that I also do the Ramesses Society lectures as well. And so we do have John Ward and Maria Nielsen who are going to be joining us from their project. I'll have to check the date with that, but I'll be sending the information out about that soon. And they're actually going to be broadcasting live from the site, so that'll be quite exciting. And it's a little bit earlier than normal. I think it's going to be 10:30 or something, so the time makes sense in Egypt. But I'll send you information about that soon. Manon, if you could send me the links to your talks in Cairo and anything else that you think is useful, I'll share that information when I share the video out. And yeah, thank you so much. Oh, Angela just asked, do you know when the gem is going to open? I guess like our guess is as good as anyone's, right?
I've just come back from Egypt on Thursday. And I heard we would hear more in the next, or in the coming 6 months, but I have heard that before.
6 months.
So but that was from someone from the Cairo Museum, so maybe in the next 6 months we might know more, because I've heard it's open for specific groups on invitation kind of thing. I was not invited, so I don't know.
Are you going to go to Zahi Hawes's Tutankhamun opera? Oops, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now, yeah.
I was just mentioning Zahi Hawes's Tutankhamun opera, which I'm looking forward to seeing what that's like.
I'm really looking forward to that as well.
Zahi Hawass has written an opera.
Yeah, well, with other people as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much he actually has written from the music.
Very little, I hope. Yes.
Maybe he just hummed it, and they, you know, someone else had to. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. That was really, really fun and really interesting and absolutely excellent, and given me lots to think about. So thank you so much.
Well, and thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, and hopefully you can do another one soon as well. And good luck with finishing it all off. Thank you so much.
Nightmares.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.